My name is Zoe Harper, and I was born in a cold December wind, raised in a wood-framed house on the edges of Willow Creek, Pennsylvania. My father was a coal miner. My mother stitched dresses in town. We didn't have much, but we had each other and enough warmth to survive the frost. I never believed I would fall in love with a man like Bradley Langford. He was from old wealth. His family owned Langford First Trust, the only private bank in town, with thick marble columns, gold-lettered signs, and clerks who wore vests just to count your coins. Bradley was polite, polished. He always smelled like cedarwood and money. I met him while delivering hand-sewn tablecloths to the Langford estate for their Christmas dinner. He noticed me, not the cloth in my hands, not the dust on my boots, but me. "You walk like you own the place," he'd said with a smile. "I only walk fast when it's cold," I'd replied. That made him laugh. A week later, he left roses at my doorstep. A month later, we were courting. A year later, he asked me to marry him with a diamond so large, it looked borrowed from his mother's vault. But I should have known. You can't just marry a Langford, you have to be one. Bradley's mother, Henrietta Langford, made no secret of her distaste. "She's charming in a modest sort of way," she once told a guest at a dinner party loud enough for me to hear. "A Harper?" his sister Olivia had whispered once. "They live by the train tracks, don't they?" Still, I stayed, not for their approval, for Bradley's love, or what I thought was love. He kissed my forehead when I was sick. He bought my father new boots when the mine shut down. He said he didn't care where I came from, but words are only warm until they're tested by the cold. Christmas Eve, 1936, our engagement was supposed to be announced that night, during the Langfords' annual winter ball. Every woman in Willow Creek dreamed of that event. I'd spent weeks sewing my own gown, cream lace, long sleeves, simple but elegant. I arrived by carriage, heart thudding, holding my breath. Bradley met me at the edge of the hall. He looked nervous. "Can we talk?" he whispered, pulling me aside. He didn't even look me in the eye when he said it. "My mother doesn't approve. She says we'll lose clients, that it's bad for the family image." That year he paused. "Too poor," he finished. He said he loved me, but he couldn't afford to go against his family. Not with the bank expanding, not with New York partners watching. He handed me an envelope. "Train fare. You can visit your aunt in Boston," he said. "Start over." I tore it in half. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "You'll regret this, Bradley Langford. I promise you. One day I'll own something you love, and I'll decide when to shut it down." I left without looking back. That night, I stood at the edge of the frozen river behind our house, watching the water crawl beneath the ice. I was poor, yes, but I wasn't powerless. Not forever. I would rise, not just to survive, but to conquer, and I knew exactly where to start. Christmas morning came cold and silent. The snow outside my window lay untouched, unlike the storm that had stirred inside me all night. My mother kept her gaze soft and her voice low as she set a plate of eggs before me. My father said nothing, just gave me a gentle pat on the shoulder before heading out to shovel the walk. They didn't ask why I came home without a ring. They knew in a town like Willow Creek, whispers traveled faster than the wind. I didn't leave for Boston. I didn't run. Instead, I asked Mr. Burroughs, the oldest clerk at the town's general store, if he knew anyone hiring. "Hiring?" He squinted. "Day after Christmas?" "Yes," I said, "and I'll work twice as hard as anyone else." He tilted his head. "Miss Zoe, you ever consider working for yourself?" That single sentence haunted me for days. Work for myself? The Harpers weren't the kind to dream of offices or oil shares. We cleaned others' houses. We stitched others' dresses. We served quietly, thanklessly. But something had shifted in me. Something the Langfords had burned down. And something deeper. I was determined to rebuild. I didn't just want work. I wanted ownership. 3 months later, I was on a train to Pittsburgh, with a second-hand coat and $20 saved in a small brown envelope. There, I slept in a room above an aging millinery, working by day at a bookkeeping office and studying by candlelight at night. I learned interest rates, debt schedules, how to calculate the true value of land against a defaulted loan. I read about the collapse of banks in the early 30s, about how smaller private institutions like Langford First Trust survived only because their founders married politics with pride. I kept a list in a little red notebook: banking laws, power structures, weak spots, and at the top of that list, Langford First Trust owned $10 million in family equity. Vulnerable. High-debt farm loans. No federal charter. I smiled every time I wrote it. Years passed, but I never let my focus drift. When other girls my age wrote letters begging their sweethearts to come home from the city, I was writing grant requests and reviewing foreclosure filings. By 1939, I'd saved enough to open a small financial firm, Harper and Finch Capital, named after the coal bird that survived the mines and always came back up singing. I wore plain dresses and a modest hat, but in every deal I made, in every struggling farmer I helped reclaim their land, I remembered how it felt to be handed a train ticket like pity. One April afternoon, while reviewing a failed property bid in Willow Creek, I saw it. Langford First Trust had extended a risky $200,000 loan to a railroad developer. The repayment schedule had slipped twice. Interest was due by November. A fire sparked behind my ribs. "It's time," I whispered. I reached out to three larger banks in Philadelphia, quietly offering to buy out the Langford note portfolio at 65 cents on the dollar. It was legal, clean, untraceable until it was too late. One banker asked, "Why do you want such a backwater bank's loan book?" "Sentimental reasons," I replied with a smile. By summer's end, I owned over 70% of Langford First Trust's delinquent debts. If the Langfords failed to make their November margin payment, they'd forfeit the bank under Pennsylvania law. They had no idea, and I wasn't going to warn them. In October, I returned to Willow Creek. No one recognized me at first. Zoe Harper, once to pour to eat at the Langford table, now arriving in a deep green motor car with city plates. I parked across from the marble steps of Langford First Trust, the same steps I once climbed, thinking love could overcome legacy. But now I knew better. Power answers only to power. Bradley wasn't inside the bank when I arrived, but Henrietta was sitting behind her polished oak desk like a queen in mourning, her lips tight and her eyes sharper than ever. "Zoe Harper," she muttered, setting down her tea. "You've done well for yourself." "No thanks to your son," I replied. "Is he around?" "Bradley is in New York, working with real bankers. We have no business with you." I handed her an envelope. She glanced at it and her face paled. She read the name on the ownership transfer twice, 3 times. "You," she gasped. "You bought our notes?" I smiled. "Not all of them, just the ones that matter." There was a quiet power in walking through the marble halls of the building that once symbolized everything I was denied: the polished brass fixtures, the columns that stretched toward hand-painted ceilings, the scent of old money and new desperation. It was all still there. But now, it answered to me. I didn't redecorate. Not right away. I wanted them all to feel the change, not through furniture, but through function. On December 24th, exactly 1 year to the date when Bradley handed me that train ticket and told me I wasn't good enough, I hung a handwritten sign on the massive walnut doors of what used to be Langford First Trust, closed for private holiday celebration, under new ownership. Inside, the transformation had already begun. The clerks, every one of them retained with better pay, were busy stringing up garlands and placing small red candles on the counters. I made sure every last person who had once been sneered at, underpaid, or passed over by the Langfords was invited to our celebration. Farmers whose loans had been ignored, seamstresses who were told to use the back door, Coleman denied credit during hard winters, all of them walked in that night with shoulders squared and heads held high. One man whispered to me, "Zoe, you're a miracle in boots." I laughed and hugged him. This wasn't just my revenge. It was justice for an entire town. But that wasn't all. At precisely 6 p.m., as sleet tapped against the arched windows and warm cider steamed in glass cups, I did what none of them expected. I invited the Langfords. Yes, all of them. A formal invitation had been delivered 2 days earlier. Embossed, sealed, and signed. "You are cordially invited to Harper Financial's first annual Christmas festival. We believe everyone deserves a second chance to learn grace." I knew they'd come. They couldn't resist a stage. The room went still when they entered, Henrietta in her stiff velvet coat, Olivia clinging to a fur wrap too large for her bony frame, and Bradley taller than I remembered, but suddenly somehow smaller. He looked at the garlands, at the smiling clerks, at the small girls spinning in circles on the marble floor. His gaze settled on me. I wore no diamonds, just a forest green wool dress with buttons down the front, and my mother's silver snowflake pin near the collar. I didn't flinch when he stepped closer. "You sent us an invitation?" he asked quietly. "Didn't want you to miss what real legacy looks like," I replied. Henrietta scoffed. This is a mockery. No, I said calmly. This is a resurrection. I stepped up onto the front days, where the old Langford family crest used to hang. Now, it was replaced by a simple plaque. For every hand that was turned away, our doors are now open. I raised my voice over the music. Last Christmas, I was told I wasn't enough, that I didn't belong, that I was too poor for this room, this family, this future. I paused. So this Christmas, I made sure none of you ever feel that way again. A small cheer echoed. Olivia's lip quivered. Bradley lowered his eyes. Then, the final twist. I stepped back, lifted a red velvet cloth from a nearby table, and revealed a small wooden box decorated like a gift. Inside, the foreclosure document, their estate, their summer home, their art holdings, all tied up in liens and failing credit debts purchased through shell companies I'd built over 5 years. It had all quietly transferred to Harper Financial. Bradley looked like he might faint. You didn't, he whispered. I did, I answered. On Christmas? I thought that would make it easier to remember. I turned to the crowd. This will be our last holiday with the Langfords as landowners in Willow Creek. Starting New Year's, we convert their estate into a community shelter and resource library. The cheers this time shook the chandeliers. Bradley stepped toward me once more, but this time, his voice was softer. You could have just left. You could have moved on. I looked him straight in the eye. That's the difference between us. You left when it got hard. I stayed until I had the keys. After the announcement, the Langfords stood still as if the room had vanished around them. Henrietta reached for the back of a chair, grasping the velvet as if her entire bloodline might collapse beneath her feet. Olivia's mascara had smudged. Bradley's jaw twitched. And me? I felt calm. Not triumphant. Not cruel. Just finished. The party continued, but I slipped away to my office, a modest room in the back of the building where I'd kept my ledgers, my books, my plans. The fireplace glowed. The records I'd kept over 5 years sat neatly stacked. My revenge had been methodical, patient, thorough. But there, in the quiet, a strange hollowness drifted in. I had everything I'd set out to take, yet the cold from that first Christmas when Bradley handed me that envelope and turned his back on love still lingered like frost on glass. I stared into the flames, wondering, was it worth it? And then a knock came at the door. I expected a clerk. Instead, it was Bradley. He stepped inside without waiting for permission. He'd removed his overcoat and his pride. His eyes didn't carry anger anymore, just a heavy, beaten kind of reflection. Zoe, he began, standing near the hearth. I won't pretend I deserve anything from you, but I came to say something I should have said a long time ago. I folded my arms. I'm listening. I did love you, back then. I loved you in the only way I knew how, which was selfish and scared. I was weak, and I let my mother run my life. I didn't interrupt. You didn't deserve what happened. And what you did, taking the bank, reshaping the town, that's something no man in this family ever had the strength to do. I raised an eyebrow. That's supposed to make me feel better? No, he said, just honest. For once, I studied him for a long moment. He had changed, not entirely, but grief can humble even the richest bloodlines. I didn't do this to humiliate you, I said. Not entirely. I did it to show myself I was never the girl who needed your last name. I was the girl who built her own. You were always more, he whispered. I just couldn't see it. Now you do, I said, standing up. And now you live with it. Bradley turned to leave, but at the door, he paused again. Can I ask you one thing? Depends. Will you ever forgive me? The silence between us stretched, thin and heavy. I already did, I said softly, but I'll never forget. He nodded once, and then he walked away for good. That night, the snow thickened. Townsfolk danced and sang under gaslit lanterns. Kids pressed their faces to the windows of what used to be Langford's, pointing at the gifts under the tree and the endless trays of food. I joined them before midnight, handing out mittens and bread to the elderly, watching mothers cradle babies with full bellies and warm coats. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the girl who'd been sent away on Christmas. I felt like the woman who built something no one could ever take away. A young girl tugged at my sleeve. Miss Zoe? Yes, sweetheart. Did you really buy a whole bank? I knelt beside her, smiled, and said, no, darling. I bought back my story. It had been days since the Christmas celebration, but the town still buzzed with what had happened at the bank. People nodded to me on the street, not with pity anymore but with something new. respect. The same clerks who once whispered behind the marble counters now stood straighter when I passed. Their daughters smiled at me from the bakery windows. The mayor himself tipped his hat, but somewhere deep inside, the ache of old heartbreak still lingered like a bruise you've forgotten until someone brushes past it. So on the morning of New Year's Eve, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out the crumpled envelope Bradley had given me on that awful Christmas. The train ticket to Boston was still inside, yellowed at the edges, and next to it, a letter I'd written but never mailed. Dear Bradley, I'm not writing this to beg. You've made your decision. I see now it was never really about love, it was about legacy. But I want you to know what you lost. You lost the girl who memorized your mother's garden just to compliment her hydrangeas. You lost the one who made coffee before your meetings and kept your secrets better than any partner ever could. You lost the girl who would have built an empire beside you, but now she'll build it without you. Merry Christmas, Bradley. And good luck finding someone who doesn't mind being second place. I folded the letter slowly and set it down beside the ticket. Then, for the first time in years, I burned them both. The fire crackled softly in the hearth as the words curled into ash. I didn't need them anymore. My revenge wasn't the bank. It wasn't the foreclosure. It wasn't the elegant humiliation. It was becoming untouchable. That afternoon, the Langford estate was officially transferred to Harper Holdings. A dozen volunteers helped pack away the china and silverware. Henrietta left without a word, escorted to a smaller home on the edge of town far from the grand entrance she once ruled. Bradley didn't come, but Olivia did. She found me in the main hall, arms crossed, watching as old portraits were taken down. You won, she said softly. I didn't come here to win, I replied. Why did you come back? I glanced at the sunbeams falling through the stained glass window. Because people like us, we aren't supposed to win. We're supposed to disappear quietly. I couldn't let that be my ending. She studied me for a long time. Then, surprisingly, she said, for what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't. That evening, I hosted the first board meeting of Harper Financial and Trust. All women, all local. All people who had once been turned away by the Langfords. Mrs. Charlotte Hennings, who ran the town's orphanage, now oversaw community loans. June Taylor, whose husband was denied a mortgage during the Depression, became head of property outreach. We didn't sip brandy or boast. We planned access, growth, fairness. Because I'd learned something bigger than revenge. Legacy isn't about blood. It's about impact. At midnight, I stood in the window of the estate, the former Langford throne, and watched fireworks bloom over Willow Creek. I thought of the girl I'd been, shivering, in a cotton coat, on a train platform, alone, ashamed, broken, and I smiled, because the girl I was now, she had rewritten everything. The next week passed like the kind of dream you wake up from just to smile and fall back asleep. Willow Creek, once a town of shadows and gatekeepers, began to change before my eyes, and maybe more incredibly because of me. The headlines in the local paper read, Harper Bank hosts first ever winter loan fair for farmers. Old Langford estate to become library, shelter by spring from castaway to community leader. Zoe Harper's unlikely Rizian. Beneath it all, a quiet energy stirred in the hearts of the people. I spent most mornings in the bank's upper office, what used to be Henrietta's tower of judgment, now filled with plants, books, and sunlight. I didn't sit behind her desk. I moved it to the corner and replaced it with a round table, where people from the town sat beside me, not beneath me. That Monday, Mr. Alton, the oldest grocer in town, came in, hat in hand. Miss Harper, he said, voice trembling, I thought I'd never live to see a woman buy the building that once turned her away. You live to see a woman do a lot more than that, Mr. Alton. I smiled. He left with a small business loan and tears in his eyes, but with every door I opened, I still felt one left unopened. Bradley's. I hadn't seen him since Christmas Eve. No telegram, no letter. Just a long silence that settled into the space where once there'd been so much noise. I didn't chase it, but I won't lie, I thought of him. In the pages of my ledger, I'd sketch his initials absent-mindedly, then cross them out, and then, just after New Year's, I heard he was leaving, moving east, New York or Baltimore. No forwarding address. That evening, I wandered through the Langford estate, my estate now for the last time before renovations began. The house still echoed with ghostly pride, the echo of whispered secrets and stitched lies. I paused in what had once been Bradley's study, His books still line the walls: Shakespeare, Poe, a full shelf of maritime law. I found a small drawer locked and pried it open. Inside was a photograph, us, Emmy and Bradley, sitting under a dogwood tree at the county fair. I was laughing so hard, my hat had fallen sideways. He was looking at me like he'd never seen the sun before. I sat down and stared at it for a long time. Later that night, I walked the snowy path back toward town alone. I passed children singing on porches, lanterns flickering, and store windows painted with pine cones and holly. The warmth of it all caught in my throat, not because it made me sad, but because I was starting to see something beyond revenge. I was seeing peace. Back at the inn, I wrote a letter, not to Bradley, to myself. Dear Zoe, you did it. And you didn't do it for him. You did it for the girl in the train station, for the mother who cried in the pantry, for every no you were ever handed. You turned it all into yes. But now it's time to build something beyond fire. It's time to plant. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer by my bed. Then I slept, truly slept for the first time in years. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Willow Creek. By mid-January, the icicles melted in long, delicate threads from the eaves of the Langford estate, now known as Harper House. A sign outside read, "Coming soon, Willow Creek's first public library and community resource center." The people couldn't stop talking about it, not because of its grandeur but because of what it stood for. A place built from the very bricks that once shut them out. The cold had always been harsh here, but now, so was memory, and both were beginning to thaw. The townspeople brought books, tools, and even furniture donations from families I never thought would speak to me. Women who once turned their backs on me in church now offered their sewing circles to stitch curtains for the reading rooms. Young boys helped unload crates. The mayor stopped by weekly, calling it the most important thing to happen here since the railway. And still I found myself strangely still. I had climbed the mountain of revenge, but on the other side, I found a quiet hill of reflection. The more I built, the more I realized the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. One morning, as I stood in the sun-drenched main hall, a soft voice called out from the back, "Miss Harper?" I turned. It was Clara Langford, Bradley's aunt, a woman who had spoken to me no more than twice in the years I dated Bradley, both times with a teaspoon of disdain and a slice of judgment. But now, she looked uncertain, as if age had finally caught up with her pride. "May I speak with you?" she asked. Of course. We walked into the parlor. She ran a gloved hand across the mantel. "I raised Bradley after his mother died," she said. "He was always fragile in ways the Langfords didn't know how to handle, so they taught him pride instead of purpose." She looked at me now, not with pity, not with disdain, but with an honesty I hadn't expected. "You made him face the man he became. That's not cruelty. That's mercy." I was silent. "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked gently. "I don't know," I answered, "but I know I won't wait." She nodded, and in that simple gesture, something healed. That night, as snow dusted the hills again, I sat on my porch with a lantern and a notebook. I began writing names, not of enemies, but of young women in town, ones I'd seen working double shifts, raising children alone, running small market stalls with little more than grit and prayer. I was going to fund their dreams. No banks, no credit tests, no men in tall offices asking for collateral, just trust and hope. I called it the Winterlight Fund, a nod to the season that had once broken me and now birthed my strength. By February, 5 women had opened their own shops: a baker, a seamstress, a piano teacher, a florist, and a young widow who'd started her own delivery business using a borrowed cart and an old mule named Huck. They wrote me letters, came by my porch with hot cider. One cried in my arms and said, "No one ever told me I could." "You always could," I whispered back. "They just didn't want you to know it." And as I sat by the fire that night, a telegram finally came from B. Langford, location Baltimore. Message: "I won't ask to come back, but I'll always remember the girl in green wool who held the world in her hands. You were never too poor. I was just too blind." I folded the message slowly. I didn't cry. I didn't laugh. I simply placed it in my journal under one word: closure. February turned into March, and the air in Willow Creek changed. It smelled less like smoke and more like thawing earth, pine needles, and hope. Where snow once blanketed the streets, crocuses began to poke through the frost. New things were rising, not just from the ground, but from the hearts of the people who once bowed to a single name: Langford. but that name was no longer a crown. It was a chapter closed, and mine, Harper Zoe Harper, was stitched onto ledgers, painted on library plaques, and whispered on street corners with pride. I was no longer that girl. I was the woman who returned, rewrote the ending, and gave others a beginning. I visited the old train station one last time, the same platform where I had once stood with a half-empty suitcase, holding back tears while Bradley Langford turned his back on me on Christmas Eve. Now, as I stood there again, wrapped in a fine wool coat I bought with my own money, I wasn't waiting for a train. I was waiting for forgiveness for myself. A boy no older than 8 approached, with a newspaper bag slung over his chest. "Miss Harper?" he asked shyly. "Yes, my mama says you're the one who saved the bakery." "Well," I smiled, "I just gave her the key. She did the rest." He grinned. "She says you're like the lady in those old books, the ones who ride in with horses and golden swords." I laughed softly. "Tell her I didn't need swords, just a little Christmas pain and a lot of January purpose." He looked confused, but nodded politely, then handed me a newspaper and disappeared into the wind. I opened it. Front page headline: Harper House opens public library attendance breaks record, and right beneath, a quote from one of the girls. I'd helped. She turned the mansion of our nightmares into a place where dreams come true. Later that week, we opened the doors officially. The library smelled of cedar and fresh ink. Inside, children ran between shelves, gasping at picture books. Older folks sat by the fireplace reading aloud. Young women browsed titles about law, medicine, architecture, the kinds of things they were never encouraged to pursue. And upstairs, in a glass case, I placed one last relic, that photograph, the one of me and Bradley at the fair where I was laughing, and he was frozen in wonder. I labeled it, Before the Storm. As evening fell, I walked out into the garden formerly Henrietta's. Now, every bush and tree had been replanted. Locals brought seeds from their homes. One man donated a sapling his wife had grown before she passed. We called it the Garden of Second Chances, and beneath the largest tree, a plaque read, "To those once overlooked, underestimated, and abandoned, may your roots grow stronger than their rejection." Just before I turned in that night, I received a letter. Not a telegram, a letter, handwritten, pressed with wax, from Bradley. "Zoe, I heard about the Winterlight Fund, the library, the garden. I won't lie, it stings, knowing none of it needed me to exist. But it also sets me free to live differently. I've joined a banking reform group. I've started over. I don't expect forgiveness, but I do hope, one day, we can meet again, not as enemies, but as people who once loved each other at the wrong time. Merry late Christmas." I folded it and placed it next to the telegram, not in my drawer, but in the fireplace, and as the embers rose into the chimney, I whispered, "I don't need your love anymore. I've grown my own." Spring came early to Willow Creek that year, as if the earth itself was eager to start over. The snow didn't resist its melting. The flowers didn't wait for permission. And for the first time in a long time, neither did I. My name no longer sounded foreign on the lips of this town. It belonged here now, like the church bells, like the wind that carried wood smoke, like the laughter of children whose mothers had once cried over loan rejections. On the first day of April, I hosted a garden tea under the magnolia tree at Harper House. The guest list: widows, seamstresses, mothers, former maids turned merchants, young girls with dreams bigger than this valley, and me, the girl they once shunned, now sitting at the head of the table with nothing but gratitude in her bones. They asked me to speak. I stood, holding a teacup of lemon verbena. "A year ago," I said, "I was left at a train station with nothing but heartbreak and an unpaid rent bill. Today, I stand on ground that tried to bury me, but it didn't know I was a seed." Laughter, then quiet tears. Revenge tastes sweet, yes, but what comes after is sweeter. Peace, impact, knowing no one can ever decide your worth again. I raised my cup. To all of us who were told we weren't enough, may we continue to prove that we were always more than they could handle. That summer, the Winterlight Fund expanded into 2 neighboring counties. Harper Bank, as the townsfolk now called it, opened its doors to artists, immigrants, farmers, and dreamers. Each loan was reviewed by a board of women, each applicant left with dignity. And Harper House, it became more than a library. It became a sanctuary. By fall, it hosted night classes for young girls. By winter, free soup kitchens. And by next Christmas, a full concert led by the very children who once passed it in fear. On Christmas Eve, 1 year to the day since my humiliation. I stood outside under falling snow. I wasn't crying this time. I was laughing with two girls from the reading program as they tried to build a snowman with more buttons than snow. Laughing with Clara Langford, who brought over jars of plum jam and asked if she could help with choir decorations. And when the lanterns were lit and the songs began, I stood in the center of the town square and whispered into the cold air, "Christmas doesn't hurt anymore." Bradley never returned, but that's okay. He was a chapter, not the book. As I sit here tonight, writing this by candlelight, I want to leave something behind, not just for those who come next, but for the girl I once was. You deserved better. You gave it to yourself, and you made sure others would never have to beg for it again. This is not a story of heartbreak. This is not a story of revenge. This is a story of reclamation. And if you're still reading this, dear listener, remember this: the people who leave you when you have nothing don't deserve you. When you build everything, let them go. Then let yourself grow. Now ask yourself, would you still love someone who only loved your status? Have you ever mistaken silence for closure? Do you believe healing and revenge can live in the same story?